Black and Tan is a podcast that begins each episode with a discussion of a type of beer that relates to the intricacies of today's fast-moving world. Hosted by Pedro Silva, an African-American advocate for social equity, and Alan Ohashi, a Japanese-American with a passion for cross-cultural engagement, the show offers insightful discussions designed to inspire personal change. Through engaging conversations, Black and Tan offers listeners practical advice and eye-opening perspectives on how to better understand others.
Thank you, Sophia, for that great introduction to our podcast, Black and Tan. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Pedro Silva. And episode 3 is about storytelling and maybe how our stories have remained the same or how they've changed. But at the end of last episode, we talked about the Modelo beer brewed in Mexico as being the number one selling beer in the United States. And then on top of that, the number one drinker of Modelo beer are Caucasian people, and Latinos are a distant second. So the question is, are we becoming a global society, and it's been just kind of slowly sneaking up on us, and now just starting to realize it, and people may be fearful of having to change their stories. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I do think that I think that we are a global society, whether we want to be or not, and people can be in denial. That's a function, a survival function that a lot of us use, but we take for granted, that we live much of our lives in extreme denial. Some people have come to see this fact as inescapable, and that whether they were wanting to or not, they've been confronted with the awareness that there's no reversing the global society that is emerging, because there's too much entangled in terms of commerce, in terms of information exchange and flow of information. There's just so much happening that we can't help but become a global society. And we'll see some indicators of that in some of the safer ways of exploring that idea, such as beverages, food, things that are critical to our body's survival. I think that those are always gateways into other cultures. So sometimes you even, when DEI wasn't being slashed and burned, people would have these cultural days, and they always started off with like, these are the foods from our culture, these are the drinks from our culture, because a lot of ways food and drink are the staples of every society, and it reflects our culture and all those other things. So I could see people being infiltrated with food and drink, probably drink first, in order to get inseminated, if you will, with dimensions, or be impregnated by other cultures. So yeah, I could see that happening. And some people, like, if they got what they wanted, some of the people who really are fighting against this global society, if we said take away all the food and drink from every other culture except for whatever they think an American is, they would be very hungry and very bland and undelicious experiences.
That's an interesting question, because I do some cultural competency trainings, and one of the questions that we talk about is about food. And for example, what kind of bread did you eat growing up? And for most mainstream Americans who are probably our age or older, they would always say something like white bread or Wonder Bread. And like in my case, it's Wonder Bread, and also flour tortillas. And that's because my mother, she her grandfather, her father, my grandfather, was a section foreman on the railroad, and he had a lot of workers from Mexico who were allowed over the border, and were called traqueros. And he supervised a bunch of them in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. And all of her friends were all these Latina kids. And she'd go over to their place and learned how to make flour tortillas. And so to the day up until she died, she used to make flour tortillas. And so I always thought that one of the worst inventions of humankind was the invention of prepackaged flour tortillas. And so so people are always a little bit surprised at that. So how about you? What kind of bread did you eat when you grew up?
My dad used to make this thing called kush, which is from Cape Verde, and it was like a cornbready type texture, and really just like a celebration every morning. And he made it by hand in this thing called a beant, which was like had like he would use a coffee can and a steam, and he would put it in the cornmeal and all the stuff inside of like a flour pot with a cheesecloth, and then steam it, and then that's how the bread would get made. And it's pretty awesome. And I never get to eat it, but sometimes my brain thinks I smell it, and I'll be like, oh man, recently I smelled something, and it has a little bit of a fragrance like a tortilla, a corn tortilla, but it has a little bit of a sweetness to it. And if you could smell steam that passes through cornmeal, and kind of have that as a fragrance, then it has that as a fragrance as well. So it's a very just like awesome smell. And unless I go to Cape Verde, I probably am not going to have any. But I ate that growing up.
So did you ever learn how to make it?
I did not. My dad showed me, but he always made it. He was like, "This is how you do it," but I never made it. But describing it to you right now makes me think I might be able to pull it off. So I may try.
Yeah, I've hang around with the Arapaho tribal members quite a bit, and they eat fry bread. And there's
Oh yeah, I've had that.
some people who really make good fry bread. Other people don't make as good at fry bread. And so the other day, which was Mardi Gras on Tuesday the 4th, I decided to try my hand at beignets that's basically the French version of fry.
Yeah,
And but only the difference between these beignets and then like tri- tribal fry bread is it's a lot more delicate and airier. And so I went and got some. My neighbor got some beignet mix from this famous restaurant in New Orleans called Cafe Du Monde. And
hmm.
so I tried my hand at it. I thought it was a royal fail. I rolled it out on the cutting board, and it's very sticky. And because you're supposed to roll it out to be like eighth of an inch thick, and then cut it into little 2-inch squares and toss that in the oil. And I had a bear of a time scraping it off the cutting board and putting it into the oil. And I'd be darned though if it didn't turn out to be just like the YouTube video showed.
Oh
And
wow.
so that sort of broke my fear that I would be unable to do it. In fact, I started like an hour and a half early in case I had to figure out a different way, or to add more of this or take away less of that. So I don't know.
Yeah,
The American food is very strange. We all have stories about our food, but I was trying to think. People ask me, "Oh, what's your favorite kind of food?" And of course, I always talk about teriyaki chicken and sushi and you know udon and noodle soup and how great that was growing up. And I mean, and then I ask, it's like Americans, what their favorite food is, and they can't really think of anything. And
mhm.
so I'm thinking that if Americans have any kind of food, that it would be like fast food, like McDonald's or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I really don't know because my palate is pretty complex simply because of the exposure I've had to a bunch of different flavors in my life, but also my my family because of the different cultural influences. Man, I think any place that's informed by Africa in any kind of way has a complexity of flavors that is like everything you eat is has a multitude of experiences in one flavor. And then if you can eat anything from those spaces, then it translates in some way to other places that may have more or less uh, uh, flavor profiles. So some have savory, some have sweet, some have salty, and it seems like the stuff that I grew up on had all of that. It was always like savory, sweet, spicy, all mixed together. And I think that I don't know if that's an African touch, but that's been my experience. And and so I can pretty much eat everything, but except for something that's not seasoned. If it doesn't have any seasoning at all, I'm like, oh no, why? I don't want a burger that just tastes like cow. Like that, like don't do that to me. Like if I eat a burger, you best believe the inside of my burger, I have chopped up onions, seasoning, and all the stuff inside of the burger. It's not gonna just taste like meat. You'll be able to eat it with no condiments and still have a mouthful of flavor. And I think that is indicative of some of the stories of the people, because I think that our stories are reflected in everything that we do and even the flavors that we're attracted to. There's just a lot there as a holistic being. But I think that like bland food reflects unimaginative stories.
Yeah, but if you're from the South, I imagine your your staple foods were had some kind of African influence to them.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you eat stuff like chitlins and hog maw or any of that kind of stuff?
I have not really had much of that because some of my family was Muslim and some of my family was Jewish. So pork was not a thing to be to be eaten. I got some of it sometimes from other places, but it wasn't a thing that my family really ate. And but I did like have it every like taste it. And I'll say chitlins. I worked at a soul food restaurant when I was a young person, and I could not stand chitlins, man. It smells so bad, and I used to have to clean the chitlin pots. I'm familiar with the fragrance, the chitlin aroma, but it's definitely not my jam. But I know a lot of people that did eat that kind of stuff because in those cultures they had to eat survive off of whatever stuff was thrown to them, and they had to make it be as good an experience as it can, especially if something stinks like chitlins. You gotta do some doctoring up. So I was exposed to that, and a lot of the food that I did eat was informed by that ability to kind of do some culinary alchemy. I think is a lot of black folks can pull that off, and especially in the South when they had to make the most of what they had. So that definitely informs um, a lot of how I experience flavors and stuff. But I didn't eat the hog maws or the chitlins too much.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of that's obviously an acquired taste. In fact, it's food choice at one level is, you know, I guess a choice because I went to a road trip from New Orleans to Tennessee to Kentucky and on down the coast to Florida several years ago with a friend. And the one of the missions of the trip was to go to a soul food place and eat hog maw and we couldn't find any chitlins anywhere, but we did find hog maw, and I just can't get a flavor for it. My friend, he's a Latino guy, and he eats menudo. He eats it all the time, and that's one
Yeah,
I tried once, and I didn't. I just that's something else. I just even though it was all spiced up, I couldn't even get a taste for it.
yeah, yeah. I know. I've been because of my family. I had like menudo and lengua and stuff like that, but I don't really like it. But
So coming from then, I didn't know you had a Jewish background. So what influences did that have on your culinary palate?
well, my great grandfather was Jewish, so because of that, the tradition of not eating like pork and all that stuff was just embedded in the family. Then my mom, she converted to Judaism when I was 20. And then she started making like challah bread and all the other staples of Passover, just because she was involved in her synagogue and she learned to pick those things up. But I was older at that point. But I also had friends that were Jewish growing up. So I would have some of the different things that they made. But it wasn't like a big part of my life until when I visited my mom. She started eating kosher and all this other stuff. So, but my family on my aunt's side, Muslims, they always ate halal, which is basically Muslim kosher. And so it was like I still had that as a part of my upbringing and respect for other people's ways of preparing food um, and seeing food for the almost like food itself becomes prayer with certain folks. So I started to get that kind of reverence for food. I think got embedded from exposure to those sorts of things, less so than the actual flavors. But except for when we ate a lot of bean pies and stuff like that in my in my aunt's family. They used to make all these like bean pies all the time. The black Muslims in Virginia, the bean pie was where it was at. So I did have a lot of bean pies.
Never heard of bean pie. Is it like a regular pie, but it's made out of beans
Yeah, yeah, just made out like lima beans.
and been in sweet and a crust and all?
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, sweet with a crust and all that stuff. Yep.
Hmm. I'm gonna have to try that because you just get tired of eating apple pies. I
Yeah,
make
yeah. Gotta have a bean pie once in a while.
I make sweet potato pies and apple pies and coconut pies. Those are the only ones I really know how to do. So I'm going to try a bean pie. That can't be too hard. Just
Nah, nah, it can't be. You might
sugar.
end up converting to Islam afterwards. Be
So
like, I gotta get this all the time.
there must be some historical and cultural significance to bean pies, but
I don't know. They used to sell them. There's always selling them on the street, selling them with the Muslim newspaper. I think it's called the Final Call or something like that. And they've always just had these brothers with bow ties on, selling bean pies in newspapers.
oh, so that would be like Louis Farrakhan's group of people.
Yeah, yeah. They started off in the NOI.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then they switched uh when Wallace Dean Muhammad jumping tracks but Wallace Dean Muhammad um when he left the it became Sunni, then my family became Sunni also.
Oh, that's interesting. So guys
Yeah.
like us, we're pretty much accustomed to eating or living in two worlds. I guess we talk about this almost every episode,
Hmm.
and having to straddle two cultures, being
Yeah.
like
Many cultures.
mainstream and then our own culture plus all these other diverse cultures. It's not like we're afraid of any of those or that
Right.
we have a xenophobia about any of that stuff. But
Right.
I was reading a statistic that by 2045, the U.S. Census Bureau speculates that the United States population is going to be majority minority
Hmm.
in 20 years. And I think they
Yeah.
pointed out that there are, I don't know, already maybe 7 or 8 states that are majority minority, including a big state, California.
Yeah. I think Texas is in that direction. At
And I
least
think
some parts of Texas.
so. Anyway, as far as stories, it seems to me that if I'm had for 500 years had my way of doing things around the United States of America, and all of a sudden there's this plurality, we become a plurality nation. Well, I have never actually talked to any Caucasian people directly about this, but I don't know. It seems to me that it has snuck up on everybody, but maybe they just haven't realized it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people realize it. That's why there's so much backlash um, from some folks who feel threatened by these changes. But one of the things about when you exploit people is you got to have them close by to exploit them. So they're gonna get in that. They're gonna be around, and then they're gonna procreate. They're gonna have kids, and you're gonna be exposed to them and to their influences, and things are just going to change. You can't exploit a person at a distance. I mean, you can, but the depth of the exploitation, it requires a kind of toxic intimacy, so that we end up being engaged in each other's lives, even if we don't want to be. Even when you hate people, you spend more time thinking about them than they might even think about themselves. So there's always this kind of like a relational entanglement with the tendency to try to colonize or control or to exploit. And so you're going to be influenced by it. It's just how it is. And there's also a guilt because deep down people know that we shouldn't treat people the way we do sometimes. So sometimes people adapt dimensions of the cultures of the people that they exploit out of a kind of a shame and guilt impulse that they may, bury underneath, but they'll do something that shows that it's is working on them underneath somewhere. And it's a sad, crazy situation where people live so much of their lives denying what is as a survival instinct. But it's what a lot of people do. But only can deny so long.
Seems to me that would be a pretty good story to start spreading around if you're trying to do, kind of under the radar resistance is telling that story about how we're becoming mass society and how it's going to be a plural society. As you know, was taking a class when I was in grad school, and one of the textbooks, which I complained about, and really didn't complain about, but I took issue with the fact that the author says that yes, we are going to become more of a heterogeneous culture, but we're going to have lots of mixed race interactions, but everybody's going to want to self-identify as being white. And of course, that's was a very fallacious kind of perspective that this author took, and I was brought that up for discussion in the class. And of course, everyone agreed that there are plenty of mixed race families and mixed race people who don't identify in all cases as being of the majority culture, the white culture. So maybe this is the story that needs to change, is that you might think that everyone's going to self-identify as Caucasian, but they're not going to.
Yeah. Yeah. I I don't know. I just some of this stuff is as is getting increasingly ridiculous as people are trying to kind of fight for some sense of identity. Um, I see this tendency for people to um, ground a sense of identity in false narratives or fake stories that don't really have any substance. And like it's very curious to me, just like, and I don't mean this in any kind of way, even though I'm sure it might insult some people, but so many people will defend this idea of whiteness or white people or something like that. But in order to be white in the way that America demands people to be white, which is different than other places, it means denying your own rootedness in wherever your people come from or wherever, especially if you're an immigrant or something like that. Like you get somebody from like Sweden or something, and when they're in Sweden, they probably don't think about being white, I can imagine, in the way that Americans think about being white. They're just being Swedish, whatever it is. And then they come here and then they have to all of a sudden join this nebulous club of whiteness that denies their Swedishness. And even though nationality and race are different, and ethnicity are different, and all these other things, in America, we try to portray this notion that to be American, that your nationality is all automatically connected to a race. And there are different ways of experiencing our identities. Um, and America tries to get people to deny that. So a French person has to become less French to be an American, which means, not to speak their language less. And obviously there's different things that you try to do to navigate new spaces. You try to learn language, you try to um, uh, experience other cultures, but America is the only place where to belong, you have to deny where you've come from. And that is pretty disgusting. And almost everyone agrees to it in order to be seen American enough. And I think it's really because of the shame of the way that this country was established and the things that they did to other people in order to establish it makes people feel shame, but they want to deny the shame, so they try to erase everything. And erasure doesn't do anything. There's no identity of erasure, but that's what we try to do here. And that means getting rid of stories, getting rid of food, getting rid of culture. And I know it's weird. It's really weird.
And that's the whole basis behind this, the idea of the melting pot that was big in the
Mm-hmm.
18th century, 19th century, because all these people, like you were talking about Sweden, Italy, Paris, France, Germany, Norway, England, they would come to the United States and lose their Englishness or their Italian
Mm-hmm.
and learn the English language. And then you put all these, you put, Parmesan cheese from Italy, and you put, Swiss cheese, and you put Gouda cheese all into a pot, and you melt it down. And what do you end up with? You end up with a pot of white cheese. And
Mm-hmm.
so it kind of worked because you learn English, you go to American schools, you learn the American way. And then when at the end, you have the opportunity to, become an American. Well, what
Mm-hmm.
started happening, in my view, is that all of a sudden there were, in fact, when there were people who did not want to annex Texas because there were people from Mexico, people from Spain, Native American people who would all of a sudden need to become Americans and then want representation or participate in the political and economic systems. And so that was a big problem as we even expanded westward. I don't think anyone expected that there would be all these other indigenous peoples who they would run into. And
Right.
so then what we end up having to throw in a few M&Ms into the pot and a few Reese's Pieces into the melting pot and a few Smarties into the melting pot. And so when you end up in the melting pot, it ends up being kind of this mix that's no longer white cheese. And so then what does that do?
Not delicious either.
It's not that delicious either. So I think that analogy kind of went out the window and when Mexico joined the United States. And it's more like a tossed salad. And you end up having, this kind of lettuce and napa cabbage from Asia and frijoles from Mexico and casabas from Africa, whatever. And you end up more having a tossed salad, and the binder is more like some kind of secret sauce that is being kind of an American, but kind of an American, but still having some self-identity. So I don't think people have recognized. I think the laws and the rules really are way too far ahead of the culture. And I think that's why we've been seeing a lot of this undoing and DEI and the American English is the official language. Well, it doesn't,
Yeah.
who cares about that? The Chinese people aren't going to speaking Chinese, and Argentinians are not going to stop speaking Spanish. It's just, it's,
Right.
it just doesn't make any sense. It's just sort of the emperor's wearing no clothes, people, and you
Right.
you just have to start accepting this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just that all goes down to people just trying to find some sense of belonging, and they can't find belonging in themselves. And so they try to find something external that makes them feel like they're a part of something. And otherwise, they're just floating in space. And so they just like whatever makes them calms their anxiety and makes them feel safe is what they're going to go for. And it's like, in the I mean it's no way for me to say it differently than this, that I think and I don't mean it as an insult, but I think that so many people are cowardly, but they won't admit that they're cowardly because they're too embarrassed and too ashamed to say how cowardly they are. So what they try to do is avoid anything that reminds them that they're, whatever, ignorant or unintelligent or whatever the case may be. And they think, well, I'm the smartest one in the room if no one is there. So they just get rid of anything that makes them feel insecure, and they think that that's a way of shoring up and firming up an identity. When in reality, we all, um, not all, but a lot of us have a lot of genius capacity inside of us that's just been uncultivated. And if we actually exposed ourselves to some new things and some new thoughts, we could find out what our brains are actually capable of, and the beauty and all the things that we could actually create. But there's no room for it because our cups are filled with fear. And so few people are willing to confront that. That's why I'm glad about this bias exhibit that's at the Boulder JCC, because it helps people see how their brains are making up stories and filling their cup with fear instead of giving them an opportunity to fill their life with wonder and be curious about all the differences that are in the world and enjoy them and experience them and taste different flavors. You know what I mean? That's what I feel like we need more of, but people are just too scared to not know and lose themselves in they feel like there's people that negate their existence just by them existing, and it's not true, but it's hard to tell a coward anything.
Now, it seems like the maybe not the wrong people, but the people who should be invited or dragged to some of these activities, such as the one you're mentioning. But then it takes, the everybody is cowardly, whether you're a progressive or whether you're a conservative, because
Right.
you might be a little bit afraid to approach this person who's a little more conservative than yourself, and vice
Right.
versa. But
Right.
so the question is, so the trick is, how do we do that? Because I do know, like, for example, there's like Czechoslovakian or Eastern European days that they have on the Pearl Street Mall. And,
Mhm.
I think maybe not enlightened people, but people who they're just interested in interesting stuff go to that. And I know there's the Japanese Cherry Blossom Festival in Denver, and same there. And I think people go to that. But it's kind of like speaking to the choir kinds of crowd.
Mhm.
And so
Right.
meanwhile, the ultra this way or the ultra that way are not lending themselves to this kind of
Right.
things.
Yeah, and I mean most of those folks won't. And I mean, I don't really concern myself with people on either extreme, because I'm in a different place. It would be like yelling across the Grand Canyon or something like that. It's like I would do not waste my breath. But there's some people who are within reach of someone else who's in reach of someone else who's in reach of someone else that may connect with those of us who realize that there's very little to be afraid of, even in this context where there's a lot of, craziness and people trying to go backwards and all these things because they're scared. Like, us being scared isn't going to undo their fear. And I'm not concerned about undoing their fear. I'm more concerned about connecting with awesome people and having joy and creating alternatives to some of the silliness that's out there that's so attractive that folks just say, hey, this is better than the other thing, and they're willing to give up some of the things they're holding on to for a better thing. That's basically where I'm putting my energy. And the people on the furthest ends of the extremes, I don't know what to say with them. If they believe in God, or some angel wants to, or some spiritual something wants to go grab them and snatch them up, and then I'll talk to them. But I'm definitely not going after them to try to chase them, because it's like I have no reason to do that, and and they would kick me out if I did. So, it's an interesting journey trying to live fully into the multiplicity of my own experiences while navigating relationships with people who may have less exposure or less interest and are operating from more fear than I am. So I don't know.
Well, I think that's a good idea. In fact, put that in the back of your brain, and we can, because I think the last episode that we're doing is about what can we do? And I think I think this sort of quiet protesting, or just finding people who are open to hearing certain perspectives that will eventually fan out and will eventually spread. So rather than, we talked about this in episode 1, rather than going down to the Capitol every day for the next 4 years, maybe we can figure out a way to make protesting a little bit more interesting by being a little bit more quiet about it.
Yeah, just quietly creating things. There's this, I think I mentioned the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, and I've been able to meet some really cool people by working on it. Like, this other organization that's in Boulder County called Once and Future Green, and they've been hosting a couple of BVCP events, but they were also doing their own thing called the People's Plan, that is just informed by the citizenry and folks who are not always included in the conversations, but by continuing to work on the new thing that they're creating alongside the questions that the city is asking about what do people want, and trying to get the voices of those who are less heard sometimes. By working alongside, I've been able to meet like a lot of cool people and see how much genius and beauty and artistry and wonder and all of these things that are right here among us, but we miss out on it because we keep listening to the same voices all the time, and those voices don't listen to other voices. But if we go and kind of try to beg to be heard, we're wasting our energy when we could just work together to create beautiful things. And then those folks, if they look and go, wow, that's pretty beautiful. I was too scared to see it, but now that it's here. But sometimes people have a lack of imagination. And so if you try to explain it to them, they can't get it because they have a poor imagination. But if you're able to create it and then they're able to see it, then they can go, oh, I wonder. And then they can maybe move towards something that's more relational and more hopeful and more powerful. But they can't do it just from telling them. And I think too many of us activisty type folks make the mistake of trying to yell down or convince or explain ourselves to people who don't have the ears to hear, but maybe they have the eyes to see. But we have to create it so they can see it and not be concerned about their lack of imagination. Because, you can't blame somebody for not being able to imagine something. You can't yell them into imagining something. You just have to create the thing. And that's kind of the way I try to use my energy, and like doing stuff like this and participating in other things that keep people talking and being in wonder. And I think that's the best we could do for our society and tell our stories, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And, I'm older than you, and you still have a little bit more energy than me. I'm I'm getting used up. And so just doing things that are a little bit remote, such as this podcast. I write books and go to a few meetings. But I'm to the point in my life where I'm trying to pass my stories and pass on the things that I've known and know to other people, hoping that they might glean something out of it. And that's I guess the extent of what I've been having to offer. We'll live several decades, and then they're just fleeting. And I know people who've lived longer than me, and they have lives that are still living their life and talk about their past lives. Those are the kind of people I keep telling you, got to figure out how to spread your stories around, and so
Yeah.
take advantage of your experiences. But it's that in itself is hard work, as you know. And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the more of us, a lot of us, I think we hide our stories because we're afraid that they won't be received, and the story, we feel like so much of what we do is tied up in our identity. So we think our stories are us. And so then if we tell our story and no one values it, we're like, oh, I should have just kept it to myself. But the reality is that all all of us are in one really grand story. They call it the superordinate story, and it's the story that contains all stories. And if we see ourselves as part of this superordinate story and we give ourselves our stories to our society and our community, we become enriched. So the more stories we hear from other people, the more enriched we are, and the more aligned we are with the larger story, because the larger story does not ignore anyone or anything. And so when we allow ourselves to be partakers of the many stories that are among us, we become more closely aligned with the whole story. Many of us have this little piece of snippet living our lives like a movie preview and don't get the full story. But every time we meet another person and have an exchange and it's authentic and deep and revealing and vulnerable, then we become more of ourselves, more in line with the a power that we could hardly fathom. But we just live live so sad the way people live. But it's their choice.
And I think that's one of the reasons I like to write stuff down or and do these podcasts. So not only does
Mm-hmm.
our stories get out there, out in the ether, but they also get recorded and they get memorialized. And I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yep.
this I think it's a good segue to next time. The episode is about tone. And I was thinking
Hmm.
about IPA beer, India Pale.
Yeah.
No, there was a point in time when I just couldn't even stand them. They made me gag. I couldn't even drink them.
Yeah.
And then I got sick back 10 years ago, and went over to my neighbor's house, asked him if he had a beer, and he said, "All I got are these IPAs." It was I said, "Okay, I'll choke it down," and so I took a swig of it, and all of a sudden this IPA tasted smooth and sweet and really I enjoyed them, and that's all basically all I drink now are IPAs. And so,
Wow.
the question is, how can we change the tone of our stories, or what kinds of things can happen to us that causes us to change the story? Maybe it's some
Mm.
kind of religious experience, or maybe it's some kind of personal experience, or whatever. But how
Yeah.
can we do to change our stories and change the tone of our stories?
Yeah. No, that's a good one. Yeah, I look forward to seeing what we come up with.
All right. Well, Pedro, thanks for stopping in with, and I think we had a good conversation about storytelling, and I don't know if we ever solve anything with these, but maybe give some people some ideas to at least think about.
Yeah, as long as people are scratching their heads, I consider it successful.
Thanks for listening to Black and Tan with Pedro Silva and Alan Ohashi. Join us next time for another insightful episode with stories in the context of a different brand of beer. Black and Tan is a Boulder community media production and available on many of your favorite podcast platforms.